Hi. So, a while ago, I read a book series called Perfected. It was a YA series inexplicably about a world where humans were kept as domestic pets. I discussed some of the oddities of how humans and pets were classified in the universe and how the world building failed because, and especially because the pets were obviously 100% human. And so the moral leap required for everyone to be cool with that didn't add up, among many other things. But I also pointed out in that video, which I'd highly recommend the review for it because Perfected is a wild journey. So I pointed out that, among many other things, that I think the idea is a very valid one. I think that examining a sci-fi kind of world or setting where humans are kept as pets and using that as a way to explore what it means to be human and humanity is a really interesting idea. There are some things in the world, are bad ideas. But in a lot of things, there's a good idea somewhere at the core of even some of the worst books out there. There's something interesting that they were trying to do that maybe they didn't manage to do. And this is all very relevant for the book I'm talking about today. So when I was discussing Perfected, I got a ton of comments from people suggesting that I read Tender is the Flesh. And this is a book that was kind of popular, I think, for a bit on YouTube as well, at least in the book review community. I've certainly seen people talk about it. Because the people who left the comments about Tender is the Flesh almost entirely had this particular reverence for the book and highly suggested it. I mean, the difference being that Tender is the Flesh is about a world where humans are used for meat rather than as pets, but it's still a pretty similar concept. I had my doubts just the moment I looked at what Tender is the Flesh is about, even though I like the idea quite a bit. I think, again, it's a very interesting thing to examine our relationship with humanity by thinking about our relationship with people who are denied humanity. And I thought that Tender is the Flesh then would be an interesting read, even though I got certain vibes off of it. And it's not, is the thing. Tender is the Flesh is not an interesting read. Just hold on and trust me here, because I know that this book has been very popular. There's a lot of people who talk about how it opened their eyes in a way or just shocked them, stunned them. It was crazy. It's not that crazy of a book at all. Tender is about a world where animal life has been contaminated by a virus, but the allure of meat is just so addictive that humanity has immediately defaulted to raising humans for meat instead. Where this premise could be interesting is the fact that it is a what-if sort of story. It's a near-future speculation, which has this great opportunity to take a single question, what if we raised humans for meat, and try to answer it in full. This is just one of my favorite kinds of science fiction, like the thought experiment, where you change one detail about a world and see what would happen. Shortly before I read Tender is the Flesh, I read a very good book called Extreme Makeover Apocalyptic Edition, which is very similar in terms of it's more about the world than it is about a specific character. It's just how has the world changed from this one invention or problem or whatever the heck. And I'd recommend that one. I wouldn't recommend this book, but that's a spoiler for later. So with humans as meat, the possibilities are obvious in what we might examine. For example, in Perfected, the question of what is human comes into play. What do we understand as human, and how far does our empathy go when it conflicts with our morals and, quite keyly here, our desires? The human meat in this book is not special. It is isolated from birth and artificially accelerated with hormones sometimes. But in theory, there is the potential in all the human cattle for full intelligence, kind of like wild children or people who are raised in total isolation. There's certain very key skills you pick up as a child that if you don't get, generally make it very difficult when you're an adult. And so the cattle in this book are rather like that, where it's very difficult to think of them as having higher intelligence because they've been denied any opportunity to develop higher intelligence, but they're still fully capable of it, and they're still fully human. So that is kind of a interesting question. The line then between human cattle and humanity is very thin. And I think of a story like this, you can really examine humanity, especially those who are denied it as a concept, such as the poor or immigrants or minorities, And the book mildly knows this. It mildly is aware that there are a lot of interesting themes it could be doing. Tender, however, it kind of grasps at the basics of its potential and then it just throws it out the window in order to tell you that if you eat meat, you're a brainwashed savage, an addict led along by the lies of science and the media, and that you would gleefully murder if you had the chance. Like, Tender fails because rather than ask, what is it to be human, it kind of just declares, cows are humans too. And that's a fact which is simply wrong. So all of its arguments wind up wrong too. Because rather famously, a cow is not the same thing as a human. So if your entire book is trying to furiously point to a non-sapient creature and say that it's exactly the same thing as a human, it's not going to be a very good book. Like, as much as we can examine the alternate world, we really can't hide away from the fact that Tender is the Flesh is a book about veganism, vegetarianism. It's more specifically very vegan. And so its perspective and point about the meat industry and its idea that this is a world where cattle and humans have 1-1 swapped, it's very clearly a way to get a reader to empathize more with the journey of cows. And there is plenty to be said about doing things like that. Writing is, fiction writing can be anything. That's great, honestly. The problem is that the book kind of goes on to then argue that this is a 1-1 real thing of how we treat cows now, where it makes some stuff up about how we treat cows now. And also, it's so definitely of like, this is just how the meat industry is, when that ignores the fact that the ultimate thing when it comes to animals and meat is that a cow is not a human. In real life, a cow is not a human. So if all of your arguments are built upon the empathy of seeing humans go through this, I mean, you can rest assured humans are not going through what the meat-packing cows are going through. Cows are going through that. And as much as you can feel things for cows and dislike seeing them slaughtered, you actually can never fully empathize with a cow. You will never be able to understand the intricacies of a cow's brain. It is a different creature than us. So when we try to apply our morality about the death of a cow versus the death of a human, there is a very big difference there that I feel. And if we want to even just ignore all that, because I do recognize that people have more passionate feelings about like animals, sometimes in various ways. If you want to even just ignore all of that, the book itself doesn't really work because its main thesis is basically just cows are literally people to see how they suffer, and that isn't true, and so most of the arguments fall apart. I'm gonna go into it a lot more than that. But yes, like, I know that the book also is meant to be more about misogyny and classism, and we'll get there, I'll talk about it a bit. It's mostly about meat, though. And I realize that this is this is a really hot topic. So I kind of feel like I need to roll up like my cred and my opinions and like my entire life story in order to justify my right to talk here. Like I genuinely feel quite nervous, like I'm going to be conjectured if I don't. So I don't really eat meat. I have something called ARFID, which means that I eat like 20 foods and that is it. Most of my diet is just one food. It is plain pasta. Fun fact. So I don't eat meat, really, not because of a moral argument, it's just that I don't eat it, much in the same way that I will never consume a pear, and I want to live as long as I can in my life not understanding what a pear could possibly taste like. Further context is that I grew up in Vermont, which is a rurally and liberally kind of place with a lot of farms. In my town, we had a lot of celebrations and a focus on sustainable farming and local food, the highlight of the year even being a parade where local farms marched their cows through Main Street wearing flower crowns, and we all clapped very politely because they were good cows. My stepfather also was a chicken farmer for many years and we've raised chicks from eggs to meat. So that is my meat history. Here's my meat opinion. Meat is fine. If you don't want it to eat it, like, I support you. If you don't want any animal products, I support you. But it's not a moral failing to eat meat. And the problem comes if you apply any morality to food. It's not a moral failing to eat any food, really, because assigning morality to food is how you get disordered eating. And if you think about ARFID and happen to know what ARFID is, you'll know that I'm pretty familiar with disordered eating. Mine is not particularly born from morality, but a lot of people with disordered eating and eating disorders the other way around, to put the word out there, it can be a moral thing. You can get the pressure from who knows where that makes it so that you feel morally bad for your food, and that just leads to suffering. So I have a very strong stance about this. Food is neutral. Meat is neutral. Like, we should treat animals well. We should have small farms and well-paid farmers, and if we want to eat the animals, we should eat them. In so many communities, it isn't like there's much choice. Meat is honestly very sustainable and easy, and in many cultures, it's also very important to their heritage. Sustainable meat is very much real. Factory farming's not very good. Regular old farming? Yeah, it's fine. And I have much more of an issue regarding people welfare when it comes to farming. Like, this is where I feel like I'm a saint dying on the cross for daring to say this, but I really, really care way more about the suffering of people in meatpacking plants than I care about the animals there, because there are people there and there are animals there, and one of those is a person, you know? I don't mean to sound like a great, wonderful saint, you know, for my wonderful opinions and all that. It's okay. But yes. These are my meat opinions. I realize that this is a long preamble and intro, but this is a kind of hot topic issue and book, so I feel like I need to do it, or else I might just go and get absolutely slaughtered for talking about this. I'm going to stop digressing now, and I'm sure it will be fine. But before we get into it, I do need to talk about some content warnings, trigger warnings as it were, because Tender is the Flesh is an adult book, and it is a book that contains so many of them. So content warning wise, there might be subjects in this video that are just not appropriate for you as a viewer. Just please be wise. This book is rather shocking and deals with some pretty graphic content at times. I'm going to be reading some quotes from it, but it's necessary to understand the book. So just please be warned ahead of time that this video is going to be covering topics such as cannibalism, gore, abuse, animal death and animal abuse, torture, body horror, pregnancy horror, and slavery, as it were. Thank you. So, the plot of this book. A virus has infected all animal life, making it unsafe to consume for humans. And this has led immediately to a human flesh market. Now, we need to accept certain things about a story to follow along. It's called suspending your disbelief. We have to accept this premise, and I can, but it immediately raises some very serious world-building questions. All animal life is infected, but not humans. The world resorts to extreme violence against all animals, with TV shows about brutally murdering cats and all images just removed from display anywhere. Most animals are now dead, as it's been decades of this, and obviously, if this really happened, this would represent an ecological disaster unlike we've ever seen before, because the world rather needs animals. But in this book, society is just very easy to turn towards pure hatred and eager to embrace human flesh. This is necessary for the book's plot, yet it feels like it's trying to be some sort of commentary, but feels like being the keyword as it's not given that much focus. The virus that apparently makes it unsafe to eat animals is something which the main character, Tejo, is doubtful of. The book came out before 2020, by the way, when we're going to talk about virus conspiracies, so that's important to note. Though Tejo is considered to be like a conspiracy theory in the narrative, the book also seems to agree with the notion that this is a conspiracy. Multiple times the notion that the virus is fake is brought up, and the narrative points out specifically like how universities and scientists all started talking post-virus about the need for meat, suggesting the media and these prestigious elites conditioned the population into accepting human flesh. Again, Tejo, I do have to say this a bunch, is not a great man, we'll get there, but the book doesn't challenge these ideas. And it's one of those things where obviously a narrator can be unreliable and a narrator can lie, but the evidence that the book is pretty frequent to give are not so much like he saw it on a web forum, but, I'm going to read some things. but much more in terms of suddenly all of the elite universities started talking about human flesh enthusiastically. Things that are not subtle conspiracy, I noticed like a secret sign somewhere that proves they were all in on it. This is much more a like, very obviously, it's what conspiracy theorists imagine conspiracies actually are like, where everybody just kind of is admitting it in the open for unknown reasons. He believes in a theory that some people have tried to talk about, but those who have done so publicly have been silenced. The most eminent zoologist, whose articles claimed the virus was a lie, had an opportune accident. He thinks it was all staged to reduce overpopulation. For as long as he can recall, there's been talk of a scarcity of resources. He remembers the riots in countries like China, where people killed each other as a result of overcrowding, though none of the media outlets reported the news from this angle. Page 11. So, by the way, I love the term the most eminent zoologist. I don't know if I have any zoologist viewers, but is there a chief zoologist, the most eminent zoologist in the world? I can think of few jobs that are least suitable to have a world's best zoologist thing. It's the most broad category. What do you mean by that? But yes, so looking at that quote, for example, there's a difference being drawn here between Tejo believes that it was all staged to reduce overpopulation. That's a conspiracy theory, and that's not one that, say, I as a reader would buy into. It's clearly something he believes. But then there's also some strange things about, like, the most eminent zoologist, whose articles claim the virus is a lie, had an opportune accident. So that's something that's not a, like, rumor going around. That seems like a very direct evidence that maybe the virus was a lie and they killed the most eminent zoologist who was trying to whistleblow it. It no longer seems like a conspiracy, it seems like this is fact. And to this I say, a manufactured virus by liberal elites to lead humanity into the sin of meat eating, you say. I mean, why does this give me such a bad vibe? Let's read a little bit more about it. There were massive protests, hunger strikes, complaints filed by human rights organizations, and at the same time, articles, research, and news stories that had an impact on public opinion. Prestigious universities claimed that animal protein was necessary to live. Doctors confirmed that plant protein didn't contain all the essential amino acids. Experts assured that gas emissions had been reduced, but malnutrition was on the rise. Magazines published articles on the dark side of vegetables. The protest centers began to disperse, and the media went on reporting cases of people they say had died of the animal virus. Page 11. So, what are we learning here? We're learning that, again, this conspiracy of this virus manufactured by the liberal elites of the most prestigious universities and doctors and scientists seems like it's true again, because these are not so much random rumors, but a series of extremely suspicious activity out in the open that would confirm this virus is either fake or artificially made. And there's a question if this book is a satire. I mean, it seems kind of ridiculous to even include in the list magazines published articles on the dark side of vegetables, which is a real thing that happens right now because obviously a lot of very fancy vegan replacement vegetable things, or like hit fruits and vegetables that are, they're usually extremely detrimental to things like the farmers who are picking them. Things like avocados, rather famously, or almonds. There's usually a lot of stuff about the dark side of a lot of these health foods because it comes down into the human cost, and also there's a certain environmental factor to consider when it comes to importing food from across the world or growing it in climates that's not well adjusted to. The dark side of vegetables, as it were, is a very legitimate thing that we should be talking about, but here it is lumped in as part of a liberal conspiracy to force people to eat more meats. So there's a question if this book is satire, but like as extreme as it gets, it's just too clearly invested in everything it says. Rather than trying to be ridiculous to prove a point, it has a point and it is ridiculous with it. So while Tejo is not a great guy and it may reflect his viewpoint that he believes this conspiracy, the book does not question it, only confirming the apparent inhumanity of the wealthy meat eaters around him. Tejo, as our lead, is up until about the halfway explicitly the straight man to sort of the nonsense future around him. He acts as our lead-in and the one moral core. Everybody around him is basically an insane, sadistic meat eater. He is the only one who doesn't really eat meat and is seemingly a pretty normal man. He does some bad stuff later, which I'll get to, but it'd be incorrect to blame the focus on conspiracies as evidence that Tejo is bad, rather than world-building details. The conspiracy, true or not, is suggested honestly, and it's given hints of proof. But it's bad, it's this conspiracy thing in this book, because conspiracies are bad. Conspiracies get people hurt, and conspiracies get people into cults. It's rather very easy to imagine someone claiming this is a conspiracy today. I'm almost certain it is. That the rich all secretly eat human flesh and wish to chip away at our human cores with their obsession with chemically addictive meat. Which is another thing this book posits, is the chemically addictive thing of meat. That veganism is the only true path, and probably, lest we forget, they probably mean the rich as a euphemism for the Jewish, as all conspiracy theories pretty much break down to eventually. When you ask, who's doing the lying? Who are these people who are these liberal elites? It's almost always just going to be it's the Jewish people. And because of that, I find this all rather bad. This is one of the biggest upfront criticisms I have with Tender is the Flesh. I find a lot of the meat and the veganism stuff bad as well, as we'll get into. But right on the front load, one of the reasons I think this book is just plain bad is the conspiracy thing, because it fully buys into and acts like these sorts of conspiracies are real, and I've never seen somebody talk about that and question that in the book. The book posits that after animals became unsafe to eat, the world immediately turned to cannibalism. In fact, large groups of people soon started finding and murdering others to satiate their desire for meat. In this world of this book, meat is basically a disease like vampirism. There's even a group called scavengers who lurk outside of meat processing plants, searching the rotting carcasses to satiate their need. There's just Mad Max Fury Road scavenging cannibals out there just lurking in this world casually. So here's how the transition, as the book calls, here's how it happened. Another quote. In some countries, immigrants began to disappear en masse. Immigrants, the marginalized, the poor, they were persecuted and eventually slaughtered. Legislation occurred when the governments gave in to the pressure from a big money industry that had come to a halt. They adapted the processing plants and regulations. Not long after, they began to breed people as animals to supply the massive demand for meat. Page 10. So the plot of this book is rather sparse anyways, but let's go into it. It follows Tejo, a man who appears to smoke an entire cigarette every paragraph. I'm also aware that I might be getting his name wrong. I try to look these up ahead of time, but I seem to always get it wrong. He works at a meat processing plant as a second-in-command. He recently lost his infant son, which drove his wife into such sadness that she lives with her mother and refuses to see him. He has a lousy sister, and his father is dying with dementia at an expensive care home. He's a sad man, and his life consumes much of the pages of this very short book, yet it rarely feels relevant. It might as well be another book at points, as he just sort of wanders around moping and smoking so much. The book's plot, then, is not really existent. Most of the first part follows Tejo as he just does his job. He visits buyers of the meat plant, people who are into breeding or leather, and works out deals. He takes 2 interviewees on an excruciating long trip down the factory floor, and the second part continues this nothingness. He visits a hunting game reserve, a laboratory, and he deals with cultists at his job. Primarily, this book is about a point. So much of the short length is just that, the point. We see the slaughterhouse especially in full gory detail and witness a world where humans have replaced cows. That is it. I'm not kidding when I say the first part is mostly entirely a step-by-step walkthrough of a factory meat processing floor, except they've switched cows out for humans. That is it. There's not particularly a plot point. It is just to shock and upset viewers, especially those who can't take excessive gore. I think a lot of people who read this book were too shocked by the gore to really process it as good or bad. The gore doesn't disturb me though. It's a lot, but any shock is then ruined by how over the top it is. It isn't enough to portray like a 1-1 swap of cattle for humans. The book feels the need to add in bizarre details to try and disturb the reader more. And that really left me just rolling my eyes and exasperated with just irritation. So here's a section. On the way to the exit, they pass the barn where the impregnated females are kept. Some are in cages, others lie on tables. They have no arms or legs. He looks away. He knows that at many breeding centers, it's common practice to maim the impregnated females who otherwise kill their fetuses by ramming their stomachs against the bars of the cage, or by not eating, by doing whatever it takes to prevent their babies from being born and dying in the processing plant. Page 23. So, somebody said this ages ago when I was doing, when I was discussing this book on my Discord, which link in the description. It feels often like one of those, like, I'm 14 and this is deep sort of things. That the excessive gore and violence and fixation especially on pregnancy and fetuses is the author trying to be evocative and deep. That by thinking of bizarre torture methods, I'll be too struck by the violence to just have some common sense. This is not what we do with cows. This is not how cows behave. And it's kind of a strong thing to try to shock your readers about how we treat cows by making up some just exceedingly dark gore stuff just to freak you out. Some of the worst of this is regarding domestic heads, as they're called. So rather than ever call them human or meat humans are referred to as heads, and the meat is called special meat. And I really enjoy these things because, again, there's a good potential of world building there. I like the realistic portrayal of, like, when we at one point see an ad for special meat. That is probably how we'd try to sell it. It's special meat. I like that sort of detail. And so the thing, though, with keeping domestic heads, meat humans are referred to as heads, and in domestic, it's a very wealthy status thing to have a head of your own. Not at all as a pet, just only for meat. So here's a quote on that. He knows he can raise her, that it's permitted. He's aware there are people who do so and who eat their domestic heads alive, part by part. They say the meat tastes better, claim it's really fresh. Tutorials are available that explain how, when, and where to make the cut so the product doesn't die early. Page 38. See, the book really loses a lot of its vegan steam when it just starts making things up. If this is a 1-1 transfer of humans to cattle, like, okay, we can at least talk about meat processing practices, I guess. But no one is keeping a cow and cutting it up alive. At that point, it's not a commentary on meat at all, but apparently on how all of humanity is just a day away from losing its mind and turning into sadists. Which is, like, I find the meat comparison not the best, but the notion here of humanity being intrinsically evil is worse because you cannot convince me for a second that even if we all owned human cattle, we'd all get cool about torturing and eating them alive. Like, come on. Domestic heads are a status symbol in the city. They give a household prestige. He looks at the head more closely, and when he makes out a few sets of initials, he realizes she's an FGP, or First Generation Pure. Off to the side on the countertop, he sees a book. His sister doesn't have books. The book's title is Domestic Heads, Your Guide to Death by 1,000 Cuts. There are red and brown stains in the book. He feels he might vomit. Of course, he thinks she's going to carve the head up slowly, serving pieces every time she hosts an event. The death by 1,000 cuts thing must be some sort of trend if all her guests are talking about it. An activity for the whole family, cutting up the living being in the fridge, based on a 1,000-year-old form of Chinese torture. The domestic head looks at him sadly. Page 163. So I'm putting this statement deeper in the review on purpose, even though it's kind of obvious at this point, and that statement is that Tender is the Flesh is a thought experiment too dumb to have thoughts or experiment with them. There. Now, the key plot point in this book is that Tejo is given a domestic head of his own just sort of randomly by his boss. Why is not really justified, and it doesn't matter. It's just an excuse for the plot to exist. Some guy drives up and drops off a woman and just leaves, and his boss never checked if, Tejo wanted or had a facility for this woman, and I don't think his boss ever even talks to him about this woman that we see. And with this woman, this is again where I think a lot of the shock factor comes in. Though it's hard to beat the human game preserve where like a man at one point brags about hunting people attempting to pay off debts or his desire for pregnant prey with fetuses developed enough to eat. That's real shocking, but I think this is what always gets people. Tejo does not want this woman, but he accepts her, and at the end of part 1, in fact, he has sex with her. In part 2, she's 8 months pregnant. He named her Jasmine, and she's basically a child, as she was raised in a cage. He keeps her locked in a room most of the day and has to teach her about everything. The cattle people have had their vocal cords removed to help dehumanize them, but even then, she obviously cannot mentally grow at this point in her life. Like, early infancy is extremely key for mental development, and she can't really function, as it were. Tejo's relationship with Jasmine is quite unclear. He treats her romantically at points, and at others like one of his now-dead dogs. He has a fixation on the death of his infant son, and simply just wants his child. At the very end of the book, Jasmine goes into labor. Tejo calls his estranged wife, who's been trying to reconnect but just finding him really distracted. His wife is shocked by the pregnant woman, but delivers the baby. And with this new baby to apparently replace the one that they lost, their relationship is apparently just repaired. Tejo then goes and kills Jasmine without any thought, and that's the end of the book. Let me just read the actual end of the book. When she calms down a little, he stands up and grabs her by the hair. Jasmine is only able to move her hands, is trying to reach her son. She wants to speak, to scream, but there are no sounds. He picks up the club he brought from the kitchen and hits her on the forehead, right where she's been branded. Jasmine falls to the floor, stunned, unconscious. Cecilia jumps when she hears the thud and looks at him without understanding. "Why?" she yells. "She could have given us more children." As he drags the body of the female to the barn to slaughter it, he says to Cecilia, his voice radiant, so pure it wounds, "She had the human look of a domesticated animal." Page 173. It's an ending which is shocking, I guess, but it's rather meaningless. If you think of the story as one purely about our relationship to cattle, this ending is weird. Is it that it's better to engage in bestiality than eat meat? That meat is something we simply use and abuse and think nothing of? Is this about women? The book ends suddenly and offers very little insight. I've known a lot of people who didn't even fully understand what the last line meant. Tejo is not a good man, but I say that mostly and purely based on the ending. Up until this point, he has been mostly very normal. It's just his relationship with Jasmine that is utterly bizarre. He's shown no interest in harming Jasmine and in fact is disgusted by human meat and the whole practice. So what does this ending mean? He discards her for his wife and baby and his old life. Sure, I get that. But beneath the shock factor, I can't find much meaning, especially relating to the, usual cudgel of the theme in this book. A conclusion ought to be like a culmination of the themes. It's a closing note. But this one kind of feels like an obligatory twist ending. And of course the idea that it's meant to be about more than meat is obvious to me. I initially talked about this video in like a reading vlog, and I gave some short thoughts, and a few people said they hadn't even realized that this book was a vegan thing, or saw it more about women in society or capitalism. The author is Argentinian and has spoken about the book in terms of those themes, though obviously she is also a vegan. Understanding, like, capitalism or society as a meat plant, the way the rich might torture or metaphorically or literally consume the poor, is a great idea. I just wish it was in this book. The thing with this angle of critique is that the work just isn't there. It's one thing to point out, like, the hunting lodge scene where the rich men brag about hunting humans who are only trying to survive to pay off their debts, and note that that is a critique on capitalism and class. Of course it is, that's very obvious. But what about the 80% of the book devoted to meticulously slow meandering around a meat processing plant, where every paragraph is the author trying to gross you out with entrails? What does the scene where Tejo befriends a few puppies and watches a bunch of unruly teens then torture and kill them say? It says that humans can be led to extreme violence by their culture, yes, but in this book the culture is one fixated only on meat. It's about meat. The other themes do exist in this book, and I wish they had more attention, but I'll promise you now that this book is just mostly about meat. And that's a real letdown. Few other interpretations make the ending any better, though. Jasmine is used and abused by Tejo, and then killed without care once she's provided a child. Is she an immigrant woman here? A woman in general? Or is she just a vegan's understanding of domestic farming? A cow which has fulfilled her purpose and now is just meat to harvest? This latter thing, not accurate to how farming works, makes the most sense to me. There are certainly, and I've seen this, a lot of people who believe that dairy cows are like one harvest of a child and then you murder them instantly. And I think that is probably what this is in reference to. By the end of it, Tender is a book which is very ardent about being something, but very much like the ending, I can't find any worth. It is short, I mean that's a bonus, but it is also drearily cynical at these strawmen sadists. It uses gore and shock relentlessly, but rather than horror at the human condition, it's too focused on some mythological disease of the meat eater. The body is very sacred in this book. A large point is made about funerals and how cemeteries no longer exist in this world. Funerals don't either. It is known that in public nursing homes, when the majority of seniors die or are left to die, they're sold on the black market. It's the cheapest meat money can buy because it's dry and diseased, full of pharmaceuticals. It's meat with a first and last name. In some cases, a senior's own family members will authorize a private or state-owned nursing home to sell their body and use the proceeds to pay off any debt. There are no longer funerals. It's very difficult to ensure that a body isn't disinterred or eaten. That's why many of the cemeteries were sold and others abandoned. Some still remain as relics of a time when the dead could rest in peace. Page 44. Apparently the plague of eating meat is so rampant hearses get regularly raided and graves are always dug up. All bodies are cremated, something which the book obviously considers as lesser, and which apparently means you can't hold a funeral. Funerals for ashes are referred to as a simulacrum of a funeral. All of this is definitely news and an insult to the many, many people who have buried ashes. Like, apparently I have in these many, many years never buried my father, according to this world's. As much as this might be a cultural thing to Argentina, it is treated as an international assumption, and that bothers me. The mention of the funeral point, I know, is coming very late in this little review, but it comes up multiple times in the book, and I think it supports part of my concluding thoughts. This book does not acknowledge another viewpoint but its own. Much like the accepted notion one could never bury or hold a funeral for cremated ashes, the book simply believes one could never look at meat as anything but sadistic torture. There's no wiggle room, and because of that, the potential of the premise is entirely wasted. There's only shock and gore and blood and guts, and the irritating, self-satisfied eyebrow raise of someone who's already decided that you're gonna go to hell. Thank you. I am so warm and tired, and I think that's probably obvious. This is a new microphone. I forget if I said that at the start, so I imagine the audio might be a little bit funky. I might be messing around with it a little bit more, but I hope it is overall better. And if it's worse, then I deeply apologize. I've been really busy, but I have a very big video coming out soon enough. I hope as soon as possible. And it's one of the weirdest, strangest YA book I've ever done, with also some of the most extreme trigger warnings for a YA book that I've ever done. But I think that it will be a blast, and please keep watching to find out about that, because I'm thinking of doing a live premiere. Anyways, have a great day.